I didn't realize I was being robbed because the person taking my money was the same woman who taught me how to count it. For most of my life, I believed my mother controlled my finances because she loved me. I was wrong. She controlled my finances because control was the only way she knew how to feel powerful. And by the time I understood that truth, she had already taken years of my life I could never get back. People think financial abuse only happens in marriages or toxic relationships. They never imagine it coming from a parent, especially not a mother who smiles in public, volunteers at church, and tells everyone how grateful her daughter should be. From the outside, our life looked normal, quiet, respectable. But behind closed doors, every dollar I earned, every decision I made, every step toward independence was quietly monitored, redirected, or blocked. I was an adult, I had a job, I worked long hours, yet somehow I never had money, never had savings, never had choices. Whenever I asked questions, my mother always had answers ready. "You're bad with money. I'm just protecting you. You'd be lost without me." And slowly, almost invisibly, I started believing her. That's how a toxic parent wins, not with fists or screams, but with doubt, with guilt, with the fear that you can't survive on your own. I didn't see it as financial abuse at first. I saw it as family, responsibility, obedience. By the time I noticed something was deeply wrong, I was already trapped in a system designed to keep me small. My bank account wasn't really mine. My paycheck didn't truly belong to me. Even my future plans had to be approved. And the scariest part? I defended her. I made excuses for her behavior. I blamed myself. I told myself this was just how mothers were. Until the day I tried to leave. That was the moment everything changed. Because control only looks like love until you try to take it away. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming matches or slammed doors. Instead, there was silence, calculation, patience. I didn't plan revenge the way people imagine it. There was no sudden confrontation, no emotional explosion. I planned survival. And while I was quietly rebuilding my life piece by piece, my mother was unknowingly setting the stage for her own karma. This isn't a story about hatred. It's a story about awakening. About realizing that sometimes the person who raised you is also the one holding you hostage. And about how escaping financial abuse from a toxic parent requires more courage than staying ever did. If you've ever felt controlled, manipulated, or made to feel incapable by someone who claimed to love you, this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. And it might make you question where love ends and control begins. I grew up believing my mother was strong, not warm, not gentle, strong. She was the kind of woman people admired from a distance, always composed, always prepared, always right. When my father left, she made sure everyone knew she had sacrificed everything for me. That story followed us everywhere, at family gatherings, at school meetings, at church. I was the daughter she gave up her life for. And because of that, I learned early that gratitude wasn't optional. It was a debt. One I could never fully repay. Money became part of that debt long before I understood what money meant. When I got my first part-time job as a teenager, she insisted on helping me open a bank account. She explained interest rates, fees, responsibility. She said, "You'll thank me later." Her name went on the account, just in case. I didn't question it. Why would I? She was my mother. Every paycheck went in. Every expense went through her. If I wanted clothes, she approved it. If I wanted to go out, she calculated it. If I asked for access, she laughed. "You don't need to worry about that." At the time, it felt safe. That's the dangerous thing about financial abuse. It often begins disguised as care. When I moved into adulthood, nothing changed, except the expectations. I worked full-time, sometimes 2 jobs. I paid rent to live in her house. I covered utilities, groceries, repairs. Still, I had no savings, no emergency fund, no idea where my money actually went. Whenever I brought it up, she'd sigh dramatically. "I handle everything because you'd mess it up. You're too emotional to make smart decisions." A toxic parent doesn't have to yell to control you. They just have to convince you that you're incapable. And I believed her. I believed I was irresponsible. I believed I was bad with money. I believed I needed her. That belief became a cage. Friends started asking why I never traveled, why I still lived at home, why I panicked over small purchases. I laughed it off, made excuses. I didn't realize I was isolated by design. The more dependent I stayed, the more power she had. The more power she had, the smaller I became. This wasn't about love anymore. It was about control. Still, I didn't call it financial abuse. I didn't call her a toxic parent. I didn't imagine revenge or karma. I just felt tired, confused, ashamed. And deep down, a quiet thought began to form, one I was terrified to say out loud. If I stay here, I will never have a life of my own. That thought didn't come with anger, it came with fear. Because leaving wouldn't just mean losing money, it would mean challenging the story she had built for decades. And that's when things started to shift, subtly, slowly, dangerously. Because once you begin questioning control, the controller always feels it first. The change didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as curiosity. I started asking simple questions, nothing confrontational, nothing accusatory, just small things. How much do I actually have saved? Can I see a statement? I'm thinking about opening my own account. Each question was met with the same response, discomfort, quickly masked as concern. My mother would pause just long enough for me to notice. Then she'd smile. "Why are you suddenly obsessed with money? Do you not trust me?" That was the first time I felt the shift. Not anger, not fear, guilt. That's how gaslighting works in financial abuse. You ask for clarity, and they make you feel disloyal. She began reminding me of everything she'd done for me. Late nights, missed opportunities, a life she claimed she never got to live. Every conversation about money turned into a conversation about sacrifice, and somehow I always walked away apologizing. At work, something else started bothering me. My paycheck amounts were consistent, my hours were logged, my performance reviews were strong, yet my available balance never reflected that. When I mentioned it, my mother said there were unexpected expenses, repairs, taxes, emergencies. Always vague, never documented. I asked for receipts once. She laughed. "You sound paranoid." That word stuck with me. Paranoid. Was I? A toxic parent doesn't deny reality outright. They just reshape it until you doubt your own perception. Then came the restrictions. She began questioning where I went, who I spoke to, why I needed new clothes for work. She discouraged friendships that talked about independence. She mocked people my age who lived alone. They're drowning in debt. They'll come crawling back. Every warning sounded like protection, but it felt like a threat. I noticed she'd get irritated when I worked overtime, when I talked about promotions, when I seemed hopeful, because hope is dangerous to control. One night, I overheard her on the phone. She was talking to a relative about me. She'd never survive on her own. I manage everything. Not we, I. That was the moment I stopped feeling safe. This wasn't concern, it was ownership. I began researching quietly, articles, stories, signs. That's when the phrase financial abuse appeared on my screen. I read it once, then again. Restricted access to money, forced dependency. Manipulation masked as care. My chest tightened. I didn't want to label my mother a toxic parent. That felt disloyal, cruel, but the patterns were undeniable. And still, I didn't plan revenge. I didn't dream about karma. I just wanted to know the truth. So I did something small, something quiet. I asked my employer for digital copies of my past pay stubs. When they arrived in my inbox, I stared at the numbers for a long time. They didn't match what I'd been told, not even close. That was the first crack in the foundation, and once a crack appears, everything built on control starts to shake. I didn't confront her right away. I needed time to breathe, to think, to make sure I wasn't imagining things. So I sat on my bed that night, laptop open, pay stubs glowing on the screen, line after line, month after month. The numbers told a story I had never been allowed to hear. I had earned far more than I thought, far more. Enough to have savings, enough to have choices, enough to have left years ago. My hands were shaking, not with anger, but with grief. This wasn't just financial abuse. This was time theft, life theft. I cross-checked deposits, transfers, account balances she had shown me over the years. There were gaps, unexplained withdrawals, patterns I couldn't ignore. The realization hit me slowly, then all at once. She hadn't just managed my money, she had redirected it. When I finally asked her, calmly, carefully, she didn't deny it. She deflected. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded, expression controlled. "You wouldn't understand. It was for the household. You live here, you benefit." Her voice was steady, practiced. I showed her the pay stubs, the totals. She barely glanced at them. That's when something inside me broke. Not because of the money, but because she didn't even pretend to care how I felt. I asked one final question. "Why didn't you ever tell me the truth?" She sighed. "Because you would have left." The room went silent. In that moment, every doubt disappeared. This wasn't protection, this was possession. A toxic parent doesn't panic when you're hurt, they panic when they're losing control. I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Clarity. There was no screaming, no tears, just the cold understanding that the person who raised me had built a system to keep me dependent. And the worst part? She thought she was justified. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every memory, every time I felt guilty for wanting more, every opportunity I turned down, every dream I postponed. I realized something terrifying and liberating at the same time. If I confronted her emotionally, I would lose. She was better at that game. If I left impulsively, I would fail. I had been stripped of resources by design. So I made a decision. I wouldn't fight her, I wouldn't argue, and I definitely wouldn't announce my escape. This wouldn't be explosive revenge. It would be quiet, strategic. And as for karma, I didn't need to create it. I just needed to step out of the way and let her own actions catch up with her. That was the night I stopped being her daughter in the way she wanted, and the night I started becoming someone she could no longer control. I didn't change my behavior overnight. That was the hardest part. Every instinct told me to pull away, to protect myself emotionally. But I knew distance would alert her, so I stayed normal. I smiled. I followed routines. I played the role she expected. That's how you survive financial abuse from a toxic parent. You don't expose awareness too soon. Behind the scenes, I started building an exit. The first step was knowledge. I scheduled a private meeting with my bank during my lunch break, a different branch, a different teller. When I explained the situation, the woman across the desk didn't look shocked, she looked concerned. She called it what it was: financial abuse. Hearing it out loud felt unreal, like someone had finally translated my life into a language that made sense. We opened a new account in my name only. No joint access, no just in case. I redirected a small portion of my paycheck at first, just enough not to be noticed. Then a little more. I didn't touch the shared account. I let my mother believe everything was unchanged. That was the beginning of my revenge. Not punishment, but reclamation. Next came documents. I quietly gathered my birth certificate, my social security information, employment records. Each paper felt like a piece of myself being returned. I kept them hidden, not locked away, just out of her reach. I also started tracking everything. Dates, amounts, conversations. Not because I planned to confront her, but because truth is power. A toxic parent thrives in vagueness. Clarity weakens them. At home, she sensed something. She started asking questions again, subtle ones. "You seem busy. You're working a lot." I answered calmly, neutrally. I gave her nothing to push against. That's what she hated most. Control needs resistance to justify itself. As weeks passed, my private savings grew. For the first time in my life, I had money she couldn't see, money she couldn't touch. The emotional shift was immediate. I stood straighter. I slept better. I breathed differently. She noticed. She began creating small crises, unexpected bills, sudden needs. This was her testing the leash. I paid what I owed, nothing more. No panic, no apologies. That's when her confidence started to crack, because financial abuse only works when fear fills the gaps, and fear was no longer doing the work for her. I wasn't cruel, I wasn't cold, I was simply unavailable for manipulation. That's the kind of revenge that feels invisible until it's too late to stop. I didn't want to destroy her, I just wanted my life back. And without realizing it, she was stepping closer and closer to the edge she had built herself. All I had to do was stay quiet and let gravity do the rest. Karma didn't arrive with drama, it arrived with inconvenience. The first sign was her frustration. She began complaining about money in ways she never had before. Small comments at first. "Everything is so expensive now. I don't know where it all goes." I listened, noted, said nothing, because for the first time she was feeling uncertainty, the same uncertainty she had forced me to live with for years. The shared account started running tighter, not because I had taken anything, but because I had stopped overgiving. That's the quiet truth of financial abuse. The abuser often depends on the victim more than they admit. She started miscalculating bills, missing payments. Then came the question she never thought she'd have to ask. "Do you have any extra money this month?" Her tone was casual, too casual. I told her the truth. No. Not angrily, not defensively, just no. She stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. A toxic parent expects obedience, not boundaries. She reminded me of everything again, the sacrifices, the years. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I said something I had never said before. "I've paid what I owe." That sentence landed harder than any argument ever could, because it reframed everything. This wasn't love. This was a transaction she had overstayed. Her control depended on my compliance, and that compliance was gone. Over the next few weeks, reality closed in on her. Bills stacked up, stress showed on her face, her composure cracked in public. The woman who had always seemed unshakable was suddenly overwhelmed. That's how karma works in situations like this, not as punishment, but as exposure. Her system only functioned because I was inside it. Once I stepped back, it collapsed under its own weight. She tried guilt again, then fear, then anger. None of it worked. I had already won my revenge the moment I stopped being afraid. Eventually, she accused me outright. "You're abandoning me." I didn't argue. I simply said, "I'm growing up." That was the moment she realized she couldn't control the outcome anymore. She had raised me to be dependent, but in doing so, she had also taught her exactly how her system worked, and now it was failing her. I didn't celebrate her struggle. I didn't feel joy watching her panic. What I felt was distance, and distance is where healing begins. Because the most powerful form of karma isn't suffering, it's consequence. And the consequences of financial abuse and being a toxic parent don't arrive when the victim fights back. They arrive when the victim quietly walks away.
Leaving didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief. I moved out quietly. No dramatic goodbye, no final argument. Just boxes, a borrowed car, a small apartment that echoed when I closed the door. For the first time in my life, everything I owned was mine. The silence was terrifying. No one telling me what I could spend, no one watching my choices, no one shaping my fear. That's when the weight of it all finally hit me. I wasn't just recovering from financial abuse, I was recovering from the belief that I couldn't survive without permission. The guilt lingered. Even after everything, part of me still worried about her, about whether she was okay, about whether I had been cruel. That's the damage a toxic parent leaves behind. They train you to confuse self-preservation with betrayal. Therapy helped. So did time. I learned that revenge doesn't always feel satisfying. Sometimes it feels quiet, unremarkable. And that's okay, because real karma isn't about watching someone fall. It's about refusing to fall with them. I rebuilt slowly. I learned budgeting for the first time, really learned it. I made mistakes, I corrected them, and each mistake belonged to me. That was freedom. I stopped explaining myself, stopped over-justifying decisions. I realized something important. My mother didn't ruin my life. She delayed it, and delay can be undone. I don't hate her. I understand her better now. Control had been her survival strategy long before it became my prison. Understanding doesn't mean excusing. It means choosing not to carry someone else's damage forward. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't about money. It was about boundaries. Love without autonomy isn't love. Support that demands obedience isn't support. And financial abuse doesn't need bruises to be real. If someone limits your choices, undermines your confidence, and controls your access to independence, that's control, no matter who they are. I didn't become cold. I didn't become cruel. I became careful, and that changed everything. I live simply now, honestly, and every time I check my bank balance, no matter how small or large, I feel something I never felt growing up: safe. Not because I have money, but because I finally have myself. That's the part no toxic parent ever expects, that the child they tried to contain will one day outgrow the cage without running it down, just by walking away and choosing peace instead. For a long time, I wondered if I should tell this story at all. Stories like this make people uncomfortable because they challenge a belief many of us hold tightly, that family always means safety. But silence is how financial abuse survives, especially when it comes from a toxic parent. If you're listening to this and feeling uneasy, if parts of this story sound familiar in ways you don't want to admit, that discomfort matters. Not every controlling parent is obvious. Some don't yell, some don't threaten, some simply decide what you're allowed to become, and they call it love.
I used to believe revenge had to be loud to be meaningful, that karma needed to arrive like justice in a movie. Now I know better. Sometimes revenge is choosing not to repeat the cycle. Sometimes karma is living well without explaining yourself. This story wasn't about taking anything back from my mother. It was about taking myself back. If you're still in a situation like this, know one thing. You're not weak for staying, and you're not cruel for wanting more. Control trains patience. Fear trains silence. Freedom begins the moment you allow yourself to question both. I didn't escape overnight. I didn't escape easily, but I escaped honestly, and that made all the difference. So I'll leave you with this, not as advice, but as an invitation to reflect. If the person who claims to love you also controls your choices, your confidence, or your future, what would freedom look like if you stopped asking for permission? Would you stay quiet? Would you plan in silence? Would you walk away when the time was right? Or would you keep calling control care because it feels safer than change? I don't know the answer for you, but I know this. No one deserves to earn a life they're never allowed to live, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop waiting for approval that was never meant to be given. What would you have done if you were in my place?